introducing her to you. She is a very well-known poet in Gujarati and has published some collection of poems and other forms of writing in literature. So one of her writings is Salakti Hawaye and Hastakshep, both are collections of poems. And Umid Hogi Koi, it's a drama written by her, and she is one of the most progressive thinkers and writers from Gujarat who has been for decades now fighting against communalism and also against patriarchy, and has also been part of a very vibrant, evolving a very vibrant progressive culture in Gujarat, especially after 2002. So I once again thank Swarupen for this wonderful speech. Now I invite Jairus Banaji. As I think most of us know here, he's a Marxist thinker and critic, and he had been part of the Bombay Workers' Movement and was associated with Union Research Group in the 1980s. And in 2011, he has been awarded Isaac Dusher Award for his work Theory as History, and is associated with the journal Historical Materialism, and is currently busy preparing for the conference of historical materialism, which is going to happen in Delhi in 2013. So, welcome, Jairus.
Okay, I just want to sort of talk about the state and the left, but in no particular sequence or order. I haven't got a written presentation of any sort. I'll just sort of talk extempore. I mean, India is a society full of paradox and very brutal paradoxes. I mean, consider the following fact, that the state violates its own constitution and does so repeatedly, and is probably the biggest violator of the constitution in this country. The state, which is supposed to be the guarantor and the upholder of our constitution, is the biggest violator of our constitution. Consider that. It's a paradox. The other paradox is that there are few countries in the world which have a larger working class, in the sense of working people, of a wage laboring mass, than India. I can't think of any other country, probably apart from China, which in absolute terms has a larger mass of working people or wage laborers than this country. And yet we don't have a single working class party in this country. Not one working class party. No party formed by workers, for workers, pursuing workers' interests at a political level. Okay? And on the other hand, our kind of politics is saturated with parties. There are more parties than you could possibly want to count. So that's another paradox, that India has a massive, a very substantial class of wage laborers, but not a single party of the working class. And what I want to suggest to you, by way of throwing out ideas for your deliberations over the next 2 days, is you disentangle the issue of the left from the issue of a revolutionary party. Don't conflate them. Okay? We automatically tend to think that when we discuss the left, we are talking about the Revolutionary Party, as if they are the same thing. I think the left has to define a role for itself in relation to the possibility of the emergence of a revolutionary party or a radical party from within the mass of working people in this country. Okay? If a revolutionary party has any chance of emerging in India over the next 10 to 15 years, and those chances look very bleak at the moment, they look slim, then it will be from within the mass of working people within this country. Okay? It will not be because the left has founded another party, yet another party, or because the left has successfully fused with many other radical parties to form a revolutionary party. If there is going to be a party that is truly radical in its impulse, which can truly contest the stranglehold of capital in this country, contest capitalism in this country, in concrete and practical ways, it will have to come from workers themselves. And when I say workers, I don't mean just industrial workers. I don't mean just workers in manufacturing. I mean workers in the broadest possible sense, to include white-collar groups, for example, salaried wage earners, for example, people who work in the bureaucracy, people who work in the government offices. The kind of vision of a working class that, in fact, Faizan Faiz has in his poetry, which is a kind of plebeian democracy, a democracy of the masses, but those masses are internally diverse. They range all the way from the white-collar groups to, at the other end, to tribals who are subjected to various forms of exploitation and oppression, whose labor is essentially subsumed into capital, but in more complex ways, in more complex forms. And between those two poles, between the proletarianized Adivasis on the one hand, and the white-collar groups within the urban economy on the other hand, you have the large mass of workers who are not just industrial. They work on construction sites, they work in the docks, they work in the railways, they work in transport, and so on. And what about, those millions of people in this country who subsist as what the manifesto, the NSI manifesto, calls petty commodity producers? I mean, I don't entirely agree with the expression petty commodity producer, but I agree with what the manifesto is saying about them, which is that they're essentially subsumed into capital, that they're essentially effectively exploited by capital, that surplus value is also being generated through their labor. So when you consider the working class in this sense as the mass of the working people in this country, it's internally hugely diverse, very diverse. That's another sense of diversity that we ought to celebrate and not complain about or mourn. We ought to celebrate it, because I think ultimately the strength of the movement in this country is going to come from that diversity, from the ability to combine all these very different conditions of employment, very different sorts of working classes of labor, into one broadly uniform movement. But the Revolutionary Party is not going to come from the left, it's going to come from the working class, it's going to come from the mass of the working people. Now how? That is where the left becomes significant and relevant for us. Because on the one hand, I'm saying the left can't substitute itself for the working class and for a workers' party. But on the other, nor can it short-circuit that process. But it plays an absolutely decisive, pivotal role in encouraging the emergence and the formation of such a party from within the mass of the working people. That is essentially E.P. Thompson's vision going back to the 1950s. When he wrote the Manifesto for the New Left in 1956, I think Thompson wrote this manifesto. He had this kind of a vision of socialists from the middle class, from other classes in society, who are interacting with workers and groups of workers in creative and experimental ways to encourage a culture of working class radicalism. Literally the only significant movement I can think of in this country which encouraged a culture of working class radicalism was Niyogi's union movement. Why Niyogi remains so spectacular and so unique as an expression of working class politics in this country is precisely because we began to see working class self-activity in a practical way in the Dali Rajhara mines, in the kind of activities that the union movement, it was like a river that had burst its banks. It began to spill over into directions which the left would never have believed. They were constructing workers' hospitals, they were effectively projecting themselves as a working class community. And I think this is the vision of a communist party that Gramsci had, at least in 1920, when the Italian workers' movement was being pushed back onto the defensive and being defeated, when the workers' occupations had been crushed. This is what Gramsci wrote in the middle of 1920. He said, "Can a communist party exist as a party of action if there does not exist in the midst of the mass a spirit of historical initiative and an aspiration towards industrial autonomy, which must find their reflection and their synthesis in the Communist Party?" This is an extremely subtle vision of the relationship between the party and the class. Gramsci is saying that the Communist Party cannot exist unless it exists as the synthesis and the expression, the organic expression of what he calls this spirit of historical initiative and an aspiration towards industrial autonomy. That is what has to exist within the working people before a communist party can emerge in any viable, serious sense. That is what has to exist. Capital knows this much better than the workers do. Capital knows it better than the left does. Because capital has done its very best to make sure that the workers are disaggregated, that they exist in a state which is effectively inorganic, like malleable, like putty of some sort, that they exist in a molecular state, in a state of complete, hopeless disorganization, so that there is no chance of this historical spirit of historical initiative, this the drive towards industrial autonomy. There's no chance of those emerging. Capital has learned the lessons, and I'd like to suggest that the whole of the latter part of the 20th century, a large part of the 20th century, was essentially geared to this one strategic objective of making sure that workers would no longer be a threat to capital. And they did it by reorganizing labor processes, by reorganizing production, by dispersing, fragmenting labor, deunionizing the labor market, dispersing production, making sure those units of production were small rather than big. The whole premise of Marx in Capital is that as accumulation proceeds and as capital expands, as accumulation continues, larger and larger units of production are emerging as an expression of more and more concentrated capital. The more capital is concentrated, the larger the units of production. That is Marx's assumption in Capital. And therefore, for Marx, what is actually educating the working class is the labor process itself, its experience within production. The fact that it is being organized in certain ways by capital, the fact that it is subjected to certain forms of discipline within the labor process, within capitalist labor processes which are massively concentrated, which reflect increasingly socialized forms of capital. That hasn't happened. It hasn't happened because what Marx does, both in the manifesto and in Capital, is to deprive capital of the moment of managerial autonomy. Okay? Between capital and reality, capital in Marxist sense and reality, lies this moment of managerial decision-making, of autonomy. Managements can decide that if workers are too much of a threat in large units of production, they'll break those units of production up into smaller units of production. That's not something that Marx envisages as a possibility. Managements can decide that to break the cohesion of the working class, they might have to divide them into different employment statuses, employ some workers as contract workers, others as temporary labor, others as permanent. And having worked with the unions in Bombay, I know how critical, how crucial this particular aspect is. What happened in Bombay was that employers fought for control of the labor market, and they won control of the labor market by the 1980s. Maybe the turning point was the defeat of the textile strike in Bombay, maybe. It doesn't particularly matter where the turning point lies. The fact is that by the 1980s, they had established wide-ranging control over the labor market, and unions had lost that control. And once that happened, it was fatal. It was a fatal turning point. Because with a workforce that was already divided into differential employment statuses, there was no way that the unions of permanent employees could survive. They fought an increasingly embattled existence throughout the late 1980s and the 1990s. Come liberalization, come the new economic policies of 91, with the finance ministry sending a circular to all management saying that you will be given tax breaks if you go in for VRS. Remember, it's the finance ministry, it's the state which is leading capital, encouraging capital to actually shed labor. And as soon as they hear they're given tax breaks for VRS, then VRSs proliferate rapidly throughout the 1990s. Entire plants shut down. The land is bought by real estate speculators and builders. Shopping malls are constructed in place of what used to be once thriving factories. This is effectively the transformation of Bombay. It took place over a period of 1 or 2 decades in the 1990s and the 2000s. Okay? Now the shopping mall is a different kind of geography. It's a new kind of class that emerges. The symbol of the shopping mall, the shopping mall itself is a symbol of a new kind of class. It's the new middle class of the 1990s. And there is no class in India that is more self-obsessed, more egotistical, more brutally unequal and celebrating its inequality than this new middle class that emerges in the 1990s, mainly in the urban areas. The shopping mall is the emblem of its class consciousness. It's the language in which it speaks class, so to speak. This middle class, absorbed in what Pasolini, the Italian director, already as early as the 1960s called liberal hedonism, that was Pasolini's expression, liberal hedonism, which is exactly what you see in the shopping malls. It's a celebration of consumption. It's a celebration of the consumption of one particular class in a society where the mass of the population is subjected to the most horrid deprivations, widespread malnutrition, lack of any public health system, all right? And they spend a large part of their wages buying medicines on the basis of no reliable medical advice, buying medicines which may or may not work. They are subjected to the most horrific deprivations in nutritional terms, in terms of housing, and in terms of, not just nutritional standards in housing, but in the general ways of life. So in the midst of a society characterized by such stark deprivation, you have a new elite emerging, a middle-class elite emerging, which celebrates consumption and celebrates itself celebrating consumption through the media. All right? The media are fundamental to this story. The absorption of the middle classes into what Pasolini calls liberal hedonism, but that process is taking place against the background of deepening inequalities within society, with the mass of the population subjected to vulnerable conditions of life, where they are literally poised on the balance between life and death, given their nutritional standards, given the rates of child mortality within these groups. And if you move into tribal India, then the picture becomes even more of a horror story. Precisely those parts of India where certain forms of left-wing radicalism, certain forms of left-wing politics seem to be able to thrive, but only within those circumscribed geographical areas. Now, this is the kind of picture that's emerged at a social level. A very large mass of the laboring poor in this country have no hope. The strongest weapon capital has against the working class is fatalism. Fatalism among the masses. Fatalism, and that breeds a sense of despair among people. What do I mean by fatalism? This sense of absolute isolation and powerlessness, that they can't do anything, that nothing can be changed. The left has to be able to break that psychology of fatalism, and one way of defining its role in relation to, groups of workers, organized groups of workers, is to be able to show them that they have capacities for self-management and control. Even in these dire conditions under which they have to live, they do have capacities for self-management and control. Now, this process of the left trying to define its role in relation to working people and actively being involved in their struggles in order not to be able to capture them as recruits into a potential revolutionary party, like the way a lot of the Maoist groups in this country are doing. They basically enter the unions and they enter union meetings simply in order to raid them. This is the left that I call esoteric and instrumentalist. It's esoteric because it only talks to itself. It doesn't talk to anyone else. And it's instrumentalist because it has a purely, apart from instrumental, I can't think of the word, but it has this purely utilitarian view of how to use people, how to use platforms, and to use the unions by way of raiding them in order to capture recruits. This is not the relationship between any kind of new left that emerges in this country and the mass of the working people. It has to be the other way around. We want a left that valorizes lived experience over abstraction. We want a left that is capable of communicating to people so they understand what it is saying, and capable of listening and learning, and capable of seeing what is in front of you. It's crucial for the left to have the capacity to learn. Without a learning capacity, the left is not going to emerge, let alone grow. This learning capacity is vital. We started off in Bombay in the 1970s with something called a workers' inquiry. That's how we first established our contact with workers. We thought it's important for workers to put together some kind of a survey of their own conditions, of their practical conditions of life and work, from which we would be able to develop the elements of a program. So we call this the Workers' Inquiry, following examples in the UK at the time. Now, this ability to listen and to learn it seems to me crucial to the success of left politics. It's an ability that has been lost by the mass parties. They no longer have the impulse to listen and to learn. And it's an ability that is automatically blocked by any group that sees itself already as the vanguard of the working class. Okay? Now I'm saying these things because they need to be said. And I pointed out that it doesn't seem to me that we're going to have a communist party in this country in the future unless there is this spirit of historical initiative among the people themselves, among the working people themselves. And I've defined the working people in the broadest possible terms. So we have to define our role in relation to that process, and that role itself is experimental. It's not a priori. There is no success guaranteed in advance as to how this will happen. Now, about the state in this country, I want to make 2 points. India is the world's largest importer of arms. It imports more arms than any other country in the world, and no doubt, one purpose of Cameron's visit to India recently was to push arms, basically to get India to buy more British weapons. It spends something in the order of $40 billion buying arms every year. It's also the world's lowest public spender on health. Okay, it's the central government, the government of India, spends less on health in public terms than any other country in the world, and way below many African countries. Okay, now you put these two statistics together, and what kind of a state do we have? Apart from having a state that violates its own constitution repeatedly, we have a state which is committed to militarism, the purchase of arms, and we have a state that is Malthusian in its understanding and its psychology. It couldn't care less if the bulk of its population bleeds to death, dies through a kind of war of attrition declared on the masses by capital. A war of attrition where people literally just bleed to death. And as I say, the most stark image of this is the condition of the tribal communities in the central parts of India. So a militarist state and a Malthusian state. Now, if the left is not able to confront capitalism in this country in these real forms, in the forms which it takes, all right, if it's not able to confront the militarism of the Indian state and the Malthusianism of the Indian state, then what is it up against? What is it fighting? You can't fight capitalism in the abstract. There is no capitalism in the abstract. This is the face of capitalism in this country. Okay? A small elite, a powerful, well-organized elite that has pushed the country in a disastrous direction by agreeing to have a program of, for example, nuclear energy. It's committed itself to nuclear energy at a time when, for example, considering our organizational capacities in this country, our ability to actually organize, to be able to manage crises, that seems to me to be a disastrous prospect. Already it is said that Kudankulam is springing leaks of various sorts. Already there is a threat that we might be facing a major accident of some sort in Kudankulam. Now imagine several plants of this sort all along the coast of this country. Okay, so this commitment to emerging as the kind of regional superpower in the most stable sense, so that only two powers are left in the west of Turkey, only two powers are left, China and India, battling it out for supremacy in the future. What else can explain why the state in this country has so little commitment to the even the most minimal welfare standards of the mass of the working population than it does? So on the one hand, it's Malthusian. It allows people to bleed to death, by way of maybe controlling population in this way, through a kind of iron law of natural excess. And on the other hand, it's committed to a kind of militaristic nationalism. Now, in fact, the situation is much worse than this. It's worse than this in the sense that we have in this country not just the withering away of democracy, okay? There's one process that's going on, the withering away of democracy. We also have the active subversion of democracy by a fascist right wing. And I mean, when I say the BJP and the Sangh Parivar and so on are the fascist right, I mean, in any other country they would be classified as extreme right. Why do they not appear as the extreme right in this country? Because they've been so massively mainstreamed by the media. Okay? This process of lending legitimacy to people who are actually criminals, people who have repeatedly engaged in hate speech, people who have repeatedly instigated large-scale communal violence, people who are directly implicated in mass murder, such as Modi is, for example. The process of mainstreaming these elements so that they finally appear benign and appear suitable to be prime ministers of this country, that is absolutely shocking. It's a stunning verdict on the nature of our media. Now, the active subversion of democracy is taking place in all kinds of ways in this country. It's not just taking place through the communalization of the state apparatus, of police forces and so on and so forth. It's taking place through what used to be called in Italy, for example, in the 1970s, the strategy of tension, which is that I don't have much time, but therefore I want to point out how fascists are working in this country, what the fascist strategy is in this country. It seems to me there's a twofold strategy at work. On the one hand, the strategy of tension involves creating a sense of panic in the population at large through bomb blasts. Okay? It's convenient that you can blame those blasts on, for example, the Indian Mujahideen or whoever else. It's convenient that you can do that, but you are planting the bombs in order to create a sense of panic in the population so that democracy feels as if it's under siege, and it is under siege. It's under siege because every attempt to produce a more authoritarian state, a state that clamps down on quote-unquote terror, is effectively a further withering of democracy, a further atrophy of democracy. And we've seen this with the terrorism cases in this country and the terrorism trials in this country. Even a brilliant lawyer like Shahid Azmi could not be tolerated by the system. They had to assassinate him in broad daylight. He was shot in his own office at something like 6:30 or 7 in the evening because he was exposing the fabrication of evidence in the case of, in one particular terror trial. Shahid Azmi managed to expose very well how the Bombay police had fabricated evidence in this case. Shortly afterwards, just a few days afterwards, literally, he was shot in broad daylight in his office. And so on the one hand, the right wing, the extreme right or whatever, is implicated in a strategy of tension, of planting bombs to create a panic in the population so that they feel, yes, 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 we need a harder state, we need a stronger state, they need to clamp down in this way. And the other strategy is, at least in the last 2 to 3 years, has been derange the functioning of Parliament. Do not allow Parliament to function, because that way the ruling party loses all sense of credibility. It emerges as a weak party, as a party which is hopeless, which cannot control even the affairs of Parliament. So the real point behind all this stuff about the Hindu terror remarks of Shinde, the real point about, them throwing a fit about it, is not that they were really shocked. For God's sake, everyone has known that they're implicated in terror. Everyone knows that. The Sangh Parivar and its manifold avatars is implicated in terror throughout this country in manifold ways. Okay? So they were not really shocked about that. The real point is that they need an excuse. At any given point of time, they need an excuse to derange the functioning of Parliament. So 2 years ago, what was it? It was corruption. They latched on to the Hazare movement and made corruption the main issue, and they paralyzed the functioning of Parliament for some, inordinate period of time. Today, when corruption is not a live issue in the same sense as it was, say, 2 years ago, they've made these Hindu terror remarks, and tomorrow it will be something else. All they need is an excuse to derange the functioning of Parliament. Okay? That is the real point. Not all this shock and awe at the idea of being called terrorists and so on and so forth. And let's explain what Shinde never managed to explain. It's abysmal that he should have expressed regret for what he said. He did not have the ability to explain what was being meant. There are people from the Muslim community who see themselves, who are fanatically committed to what they see as the good of the Muslim community, and they are engaged in acts of terror. They are Muslim terrorists. Short circuit that entire process, they become Muslim terrorists. They define themselves as Muslims, and they think that they're doing this for the good of their own community. They're Muslim terrorists. There are people from within the Hindu community who are equally fanatically committed to what they perceive as something called a Hindu cause, maybe the Hindu Rashtra. They likewise commit acts of terror. They are Hindu terrorists. That is all that is meant. There is no implication at any stage that this particular religion or that particular religion is somehow innately associated with terror or terrorism. That is a sleight of hand. It was the biggest sleight of hand in the recent debate. As if when Shinde said that there are Hindu terrorists and he has evidence to link all these 10 people who we have on the list with the RSS, of course they were linked with the RSS. Of course they were. When he has evidence and so on and so forth, that is what was meant. Nothing more than that. However, the BJP very clearly makes it into a slur on the entire quote-unquote Hindu community in this country. Now, this is a crucial point. The Hindu community in this country. Muslim community in this country. These identities are purely imaginary. They do not exist. There is no Hindu community, there is no Muslim community. These are products of our heads. They exist in the head, they do not exist anywhere else. What does the right wing do? The right wing, in a society marked by extreme deprivation, does not address issues of nutrition and housing and education and health and recovery of land which is being dispossessed and so on and so forth. What do? The right wing imagines a society whose only connective tissue is ideology. Literally, for the extreme right in this country, the only connective tissue in society is ideology. They want people to eat Hindu Rashtra, to live in Hindu Rashtra, all right? To feed themselves and to cure themselves and to educate themselves with Hindu Rashtra. It's ideology, pure and simple. And there are left-wing versions of this as well, by the way. In bizarre sections of the left, there are left-wing versions of this that believe that somehow ideology is what you need in society, is the central thread. No. That's what I said, we have to valorize lived experience over abstraction. It's an extremely dangerous way of thinking. So we are faced today with a real threat of fascism in both forms. One, the withering away of democracy through the militarization of large parts of the country, and on the other hand, the active subversion of democracy by right-wing forces in this country. They have infiltrated the state, they have infiltrated the bureaucracy, they have infiltrated the police forces. The police forces in this country are thoroughly communalized, which is why you will never get to the bottom of who murdered Shahid Azmi. They themselves were behind it, you will never get to the bottom of that process. So, if the left is not able to take the issue of fascism head on, not able to confront the threat of fascism, then basically it doesn't have a future in this country. And finally, I want to say that the left has to be a synthesis of all the past traditions and not allow itself to be trapped in all the dichotomies. Debates about party versus economism, debates about, how much importance to ascribe to feminism, gender, etc., etc. We have to be able to integrate in some way all these kinds of political subcultures, because they are all political subcultures of the revolutionary left. Feminism is a fundamental part of the revolutionary left, and thereby it becomes socialist feminism. And likewise, struggles against caste are a fundamental part of the revolutionary left, but not identities which then emerge as rigid identities based on those struggles. Not that kind of identity politics, but the struggles themselves, the struggle to emancipate oneself from the caste system and to abolish the caste system. And so across the board, it has to be a left which builds a culture of solidarity. It emerges as a synthesis of all these political subcultures, and it is profoundly rooted within the working class. Outside the working class, it won't have oxygen to survive. Within the working class, it will be able to thrive and maybe create a future for all of us. Thanks.